When Nazi Germany capitulated in May 1945, more than 100 U-boats were still operational at sea. In the days that followed, they began to surface in sheltered anchorages and peaceful ports, their long, stealthy war beneath the waves finally at an end. What happened next was unlike anything navies had managed before. Hundreds of submarines were taken, examined, and in many cases deliberately sunk. This is the story of what became of the U-boat fleet after the Second World War. On 8 May 1945, with the unconditional surrender signed, Admiral Karl Donitz, Hitler's successor and a former U-boat commander himself, issued a straightforward operational order. U-boats were to surface immediately, fly a white flag, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The wolf packs that had stalked the Atlantic for half a decade obeyed. Over the next weeks, more than 150 submarines rose from the ocean. Exhausted crews, often thin and hollow-eyed after months at sea, hauled up flags and steamed toward Allied ports as reconnaissance aircraft watched overhead. Ports such as Loch Arabole in northern Scotland, Lysahally in Northern Ireland, and Portland in southern England became arrival points for these surrendered boats. The process was tightly controlled. Allied warships escorted the submarines into harbor. Boarding parties from the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy took possession. Signals books, code material, and technical documentation were seized, and sailors and officers were taken ashore for interrogation. At Loch Arabole, for a time, scores of U-boats lay in a grim line, a visual testament to the end of the Kriegsmarine's undersea campaign. The logistical burden of gathering and securing so many submarines was enormous. Tugs and prize crews had to escort rusting hulls from ports across occupied Europe. Some submarines never reached harbor. A number were scuttled by their own captains before Allied teams could board. Others broke down and were towed in crippled condition. In the immediate aftermath, Allied planners confronted a pressing question: what should be done with the world's most sophisticated submarine fleet? The major Allied navies recognized different values in the captured boats. The United States and Britain saw huge intelligence and technical potential, particularly in the late-war German designs. The Soviet Union, already looking ahead to its own post-war navy and the emerging rivalry with the West, demanded its share of captured technology for study and incorporation. The most advanced German types, especially the streamlined high-performance Type 21 and the compact Type 23 boats, represented a quantum leap forward in submarine design and therefore attracted special attention. By the autumn of 1945, the Allies had concentrated scores of surrendered U-boats in British ports. Maintaining these vessels afloat was expensive, and temporary storage was unsustainable. The Royal Navy therefore approved a large-scale disposal program, Operation Deadlight, devised to remove and destroy most of the Kriegsmarine's wartime submarine fleet. Between November 1945 and February 1946, the operation would consign the vast majority of the Kriegsmarine's wartime submarine fleet to the deep. Operation Deadlight was a formidable maritime task. Of roughly 156 U-boats that surrendered, 116 were selected for scuttling under the Deadlight plan. The Royal Navy designated 3 disposal areas, codenamed XX, YY, and ZZ, approximately 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. There, the submarines were to be sunk by gunfire, by demolition charges, or by simply opening seacocks and letting them flood. Tow crews departed in November 1945, hauling groups of submarines from Scottish and Irish anchorages toward the dumping grounds. But most of the boats were in poor condition. Many had been at sea without proper maintenance for long stretches. Some had been damaged by Allied attacks. Others had been deliberately sabotaged by German crews before surrender. Hulls were brittle with corrosion. Ballast systems leaked. Engines were seized and structural weaknesses were common. Under rough winter seas, these debilitated hulls proved perilous to tow.
More than a third of the submarines sank before they reached the designated scuttling areas. 56 boats foundered en route, overcome by weather or with fatal structural failures, and the Royal Navy recorded these losses without attempting recovery, since Deadlight's explicit aim was destruction. Those boats that did survive the tow were then finished off at sea. Warships used everything from naval gunfire and aerial rockets to explosive charges to ensure rapid sinking. Among the vessels deliberately sent to the bottom was U-2336, one of the last boats during the war to have sunk Allied shipping, which surrendered and was later scuttled off the Irish coast in early 1946. Another, U-295, was sunk after being towed from Loch Ryan. The official end of Operation Deadlight came when the last of the designated scuttles was carried out in February 1946. Thereafter, the Atlantic claimed the remains of most of the surrendered fleet. Not all U-boats ended their careers at Deadlight. A small number of examples, primarily the most modern and innovative designs, were spared so that Allied navies could study them. The Type 21 Electro boat and the Type 23 coastal variant proved particularly interesting because their hull forms, battery capacity, and snorkel systems offered greater submerged speed and endurance than anything previously fielded. British and American engineers performed detailed examinations, trials, and even brief operational tests on selected boats. In Britain and the United States, captured submarines were taken to facilities such as Portsmouth, New London, and Aberdeen for study. Engineers investigated propulsion assemblies, snorkel installations, battery layouts, hull hydrodynamics, and sound reduction techniques, reverse engineering features where possible to inform post-war designs. To manage the retention and distribution of the better boats, the Tripartite Naval Commission, formed in August 1945, allocated surrendered submarines among the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Initially, each power received a number of boats to examine firsthand, with priority often given to Type 21 and 23 hulls. The Soviet Union, in particular, acquired several Type 21 boats and used them as templates in the rapid expansion and modernization of its submarine force. Elements of German pressure hull design, snorkel practice, and electric motor arrangements were incorporated into early Cold War Soviet classes. The U.S. Navy also gained important technical insights. Examining hull lines, silent running techniques, and improved control surfaces influenced subsequent American submarine development. One especially notable prize was U-234, intercepted and captured on 14 May 1945 while en route to Japan. Her cargo reportedly included technical components, jet engine parts, and uranium oxide reportedly destined for Tokyo. The submarine's materials and construction were examined by U.S. engineers before the hull itself was used in weapons testing and ultimately sunk during trials.
Several captured boats were formally taken into short service or used as test platforms. Canada operated some U-boats briefly for sonar and anti-submarine training. The United Kingdom conducted submerged trials on selected boats, using them to test weapons and detection systems. Ultimately, however, as the immediate technological lessons were distilled, most of these retained hulls were either scrapped or deliberately sunk when they had fulfilled their utility. Across the post-war years, a number of former Kriegsmarine boats entered the inventories of other nations rebuilding after occupation and conflict. France, having suffered occupation and destruction of its fleet, recovered and pressed several German boats into service, among them Panthers and other types adapted for training and operational use, although maintenance problems and the scarcity of spare parts limited their longevity.
Czechoslovakia, which had been a center of German chassis and component manufacture during the war, continued to produce derivatives such as the Hetzer G13, based on the Panzer 38 chassis, and operated captured Panzer IVs and Stugs briefly before transitioning to Soviet-supplied models.
Spain retained and operated quantities of Panzer IVs and Stug assault guns supplied during wartime cooperation, and in the 1960s, several of Spain's remaining Panzer IVs were transferred to Syria. Syria, in turn, used some Panzer IVs and assorted German-sourced gear in the 1950s and 1960s, keeping them in frontline service into the 1970s in places such as the Golan Heights. These wide dispersals illustrate how surplus German equipment circulated across the post-war world and remained in service wherever economies or geopolitics slowed the acquisition of newer materiel. Meanwhile, other navies collected U-boats for training, testing, or short-term operational use. Norway, Denmark, and France operated small numbers of captured vessels for coastal patrols and training. Many were later scrapped, as replacements and logistics were standardized on American or Soviet systems during the late 1940s and 1950s. The Soviet Union, for its part, dissected captured Type 21 hulls and absorbed key features into its next generation of conventional submarines, helping accelerate the Soviet underwater fleet's qualitative advance.
For the majority of the German fleet, however, fate lay on or beneath the sea. Between late 1945 and the early 1950s, extensive scrapping programs and scuttlings reduced the physical footprint of the Kriegsmarine's U-boats. Many abandoned or damaged boats were dismantled at shore yards. Elsewhere, hulks found civil engineering roles, bulldozed into riverbanks to arrest erosion, pushed into quarry fills to stabilize slopes, or simply used as massed rubble. Over time, soil and vegetation reclaimed many of these discarded hulks, and in later decades, archaeologists found them overlain by new landscapes. Operation Deadlight's wrecks remained on the seabed off northwest Ireland for decades. In the early 21st century, interest in these sunken relics revived. Between 2001 and 2003, maritime archaeologists, most notably Innes McCartney, mounted expeditions that surveyed and photographed many Deadlight wrecks using sonar and deep-water cameras. Their work identified a number of intact hulls preserved in the cold Atlantic mud, upright on the seabed, with conning towers and deck features still visible, a stark reminder of the haste with which the post-war scuttlings had been executed.
A handful of U-boats were rescued from the abyss of history and preserved as museum ships. U-995, which surrendered at Trondheim in May 1945, later served briefly in Norwegian hands before being returned to Germany in the 1960s. It is now a museum exhibit near Kiel, where visitors can step inside its cramped interior. U-505, captured intact in June 1944 in the Atlantic, survives today at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, restored and displayed as a rare example of a wartime prize shown on American soil. U-534 was raised from the Kattegat in 1993 and now sits in Birkenhead with sections removed to allow public viewing of internal spaces. France preserved a few former U-boats, such as U-123, renamed in French service, displayed at Lorient and other locations. These preserved vessels, plus displays at museums like the Tank Museum at Bovington, the Musée des Blindés in Saint-Maur, or Russia's Kubinka, ensure that some pieces of wartime hardware remain for study and public memory. Yet for every museum exhibit, dozens of submarines still rest in watery graves off the North Atlantic. The sunken fleet is an underwater memorial, silent, rusting, and scattered in deep channels, marking a technological era and the human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic. For many veterans and families, the U-boats represent both innovation and loss. Thousands of German submariners and countless Allied sailors never returned to port. In the end, Germany's submarines were dispersed in 3 ways. Many were deliberately sunk to prevent future reuse. A limited number were retained for testing and redistributed to the victorious powers, and a small minority survived to become museum pieces and training hulks. Their technological legacy, particularly the lessons drawn from the Type 21 and 23 designs, influenced submarine development in the early Cold War. Yet most of the physical fleet, the gray silhouettes that once stalked the sea lanes, was erased, returned to metal and mud. The final image is a dual memorial, wrecks on the seabed that record a violent end, and restored museum boats that offer a cramped, human window into what life beneath the waves entailed. Both kinds of relics tell the closing chapter of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, an empire of steel that ended its career under the twin forces of human surrender and deliberate destruction. Thanks for watching. If this subject interested you, check out our follow-up on what happened to Germany's tanks and other weapons after the war. Like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more History Inside. We'll see you next time.